Hey, welcome to another history briefing from the Indiana University Center for Veteran and Military Students. I'm John Summerlot. I'm director of the center and the resident history nerd. So today we're going to talk about the Indiana Guard Reserve. So you may have never heard of the IGR. They are the smallest of the three branches or units that the Adjutant General of the state of Indiana oversees. He oversees the Army National Guard, the Air National Guard, and the Indiana Guard Reserve. The IGR has a long history and a lot of history that ties in with IU and pieces of IU history that I've run across over the years. And so this is an opportunity to kind of share those connections and how those things relate to each other. We also have student, staff, and faculty and alumni that are serving in the Indiana Guard Reserve, including myself. Full disclosure, I've been serving in the IGR for about 8 years. And so this is a chance to sort of recognize those folks within our population, give them something they can reference people back to when they're talking about the Indiana Guard Reserve, this unit that you've probably never heard of within the state of Indiana. So we're going to go through this history. This is a little bit of a longer one, but we're going to run through it all in one shot, and stay with me for the journey. This is going to be the first of a three-part series on the history of the IGR. So in this first section, we're going to deal with the origins of state militia and state defense force all the way through the late 1800s. And then second part, we're going to deal with the split between the National Guard and the State Guard in early 20th century, all the way through the post-World War II era. And then in the third, we'll talk about the birth of the modern Indiana Guard Reserve. So be sure to watch all three. So if you know anything about kind of the early military history of the United States, there may be a couple of things that you know. So starting with the colonial era, before the Revolution, some of the first militias were formed in St. Augustine in 1565 and Jamestown in 1607. You know, these early colonial militias that were for defense, but also used for policing and used for disaster response, any of those sort of things. You get those that start getting formed throughout the colonies. By the time of the Revolutionary War, you have both the Continental Army and state militias. So the Continental Army, of course, under George Washington, Revolutionary Army, lots of knowledge about that. State militias are a little less recognized or a little less written about from that era. The state militias often served alongside the Continental Army. Sometimes they served under the Continental Army, but there was a discrepancy that some states didn't want their state militias to serve outside of the state because they wanted to keep their state militia close to home for defense of the state. For there wasn't widespread law enforcement during this time, so state militias served a lot of the roles that we now would see like state troopers and folks like that playing. They also were responsible for disaster response and so many other things. And so a lot of states didn't want their state militias to go and serve off in the Continental Army. But some states did, and some states would allow some to go and keep others at home. So there was this sort of divide about what to do with them during that time period. To sort of codify some of that, you get the Militia Acts of 1792 after the Revolution, and this gave the president the authority to take charge of state militias during invasion or insurrection. Meaning that the president could come in and take over a state militia, federalize it, if you will, during that time. It still wasn't clear if they could serve out of state. Could he only take them over within that state or what? That was still one of the questions that came up from that. The Militia Acts also provided for conscription of all able-bodied white male citizens ages 18 to 45 into the militia. And this was the first allowance for conscription or drafting that occurred. And this is actually part of what sort of made the Militia Acts controversial. As you can imagine today, people still have strong feelings about the draft. So the idea that every able-bodied white male citizen was going to have to serve in the militia wasn't universally accepted by everybody, partially because of these arguments over what the militia could or should be doing and if it could serve out of state or not, and some of these other things that go along with it. So with those militia acts, you get militias in the early settlements in the state of Indiana. And so a lot of Indiana was settled from south to north, mostly folks coming in along the Ohio River and moving up. The early settlement of Indiana was that way. Later on, you'd have waves of folks coming from Ohio into the central and northern parts of the state, but the early settlement was from the south. And a lot of that focused on an area between New Albany and Vincennes that was called the Buffalo Trace. And this was the kind of main overland road between New Albany and Vincennes, which were the two bigger settlements of the time period. And so, Clarksville, New Albany area, and Vincennes. And so you can see it on this map here. It sort of outlines that a little bit. And so through 1801, these structures, the militia were just kind of on their own. They were community efforts. There wasn't any sort of centralized command or any of that throughout the state. The first real sort of effort to organize a kind of larger statewide group came with a group called the Indiana Rangers in 1812. And the Rangers' job was to patrol the Buffalo Trace. And so they had 4 companies, and they kind of divided up the Buffalo Trace along the areas. And the Indiana Rangers would patrol those areas. They were responsible for both sort of military and law enforcement duties. Later on, there would be, using this Rangers model, this state Rangers model, there was a group in Texas that's considerably more famous that started a Texas Rangers group based on what they had done here in Indiana. We had a number of IU folks, including our founding father, David Maxwell, and the Dunn family that were serving in the Indiana Rangers during this time. And so they were involved in those activities and a piece of that. And then by the 1840, you start getting this idea of professionalization, and we're going to kind of follow this line of training for the military. So no longer is it just locals training locals. There's an idea that maybe there's professional training for the military that needs to happen. So Indiana University starts a military science program in 1840 with the idea of training people to serve in these militias, these local community militias that are a part of it. Also because IU was seen as a frontier college, there's a whole separate video about that you can watch if you want to learn more about that. But that sort of fits into this frontier era sort of idea of what's going on and what's happening at that point. So you have these unorganized state militias, and I say unorganized not because they're not organized at the local level, but there's no hierarchy, there's no regiments, there's no commanders, there's no division leaders, any of that sort of stuff. They're just each their own little thing. They don't have standards, they don't have standard equipment. They don't even all agree on the organizational chart as to what they're doing. So the Civil War really is the first effort to sort of organize them into an actual state unit of some sort. So you get the 6th Regiment Act of 1861, which is also called the Indiana Legion Act. And the 6th Regiment Act said, hey, we're gonna organize the militias into 6 regiments and have them prepared to defend the state of Indiana, because Kentucky's a border state and we don't really trust what they're going to do, which turned out to be the case. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the Indiana Legion gets formed out of that. They basically say, hey, we're going to appoint regiments and divisions, and we're going to keep these things organized and come up with a plan for communities to support other communities. So your militia wouldn't just be serving, if you live in Bloomington and you live in Monroe County, you might get called to go over to Greene County and go help with something that's going on over there. And so you start to see this coordinated effort across the state. And so basically they said any group of 46 to 113 men could come together to form a company. So you could have 46 people or 113 people in a company. And basically any community could form a company that wanted to put it together. So this meant that, sometimes you get a really influential person that would go out and say, hey, I want all of you to join my company and vote for me and make me your captain. I want to be your company commander. And other times you'd have, much more organized. The city would say, well, Bob's got some military experience. Let's have Bob form a company. So it was a wide variety of sort of how these companies were formed. As I said, they could elect their own officers up to captain, and then anything above that was appointed by the governor. So the governor was appointing the regimental commanders, the division commanders, those sort of things. They had to provide their own uniforms, but everything else was paid for by the county. But many found this too expensive. And so the county's providing weapons, but then they're supposed to provide their uniforms. So this meant the uniforms really varied by unit. Every unit could sort of decide their own uniforms. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, because this led to some really fascinating and interesting uniforms, including the IU group of students that organized, and they had red shirts as part of their uniform, which makes it kind of interesting. Little throwback in IU history there. The militia units could be called out by the mayor, the sheriff, the judge, or the governor, which led to a lot of politics. If your political rival was having a meeting, then you might call out the militia and say, well, they're a bunch of Southern sympathizers and copperheads. Go run over there and bust up their meeting. And so they would get called up, and so the militia is getting caught up in all the sort of politics and things that are going on during the time. When they were called into service, they were paid at the same rate as the federal army. So if you were, a private, you got a private's pay. You're a sergeant, you got a sergeant's pay. The challenge that came with this, though, was that money came out of the county budget. So you got counties that really can't afford to call out their militia all that often. However, they did start to organize training. The first official training for officers was in September 1861, and it was the U.S. Army that provided instructors. And so they got all the officers of the 6 regiments together up in Indianapolis and did some basic levels of training and instruction for them. So they had to appoint a commander. So you get your first commander of the Indiana Legion. And that is a guy named Major General John Love. So the governor appoints him a major general. And John Love is a really interesting guy. He could be a video all on his own. He has kind of a fascinating history, but he was born in Virginia, and his mother was part of the Lee family. So he's part of the Robert E. Lee family, connected through them. Robert E. Lee is a cousin of his, distant cousin, but a cousin. He would go on to graduate from West Point, and he served in the Army from 1837 to 1853. And so he served in the Mexican-American War, and he was breveted a captain. So a brevet rank meant it was kind of an honorary promotion. You would get that rank, but not necessarily that pay. It was something that could be done temporarily, or it was something that could be done long term. So sometimes in the Civil War, you hear about brevet promotions. That means the unit promoted them, but it didn't necessarily mean that Congress had agreed. So the Army could promote them, but Congress didn't agree to promote them because Congress controlled all the promotions back then. So anyway, he was a captain during the Mexican-American War. And he actually he lived in Washington, D.C., and then married the daughter of an Indiana politician in 1849, which is how he wound up coming to Indiana and moved to Indiana. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he was initially a major in the Indiana Volunteers. So the Indiana Volunteers were the units that were going off and serving under the Federal Army, and he actually left and went and served for 3 months. The start of the war, there were a lot of 3-month units, and then that later led to 3-year units, and then towards the end of the war, there's more 3-month units. So he was in one of those 3-month units, went off and served in the Indiana Volunteers. When he came back home on training duty in Indianapolis, so they sent him back to do some training and help out with the new units of the Indiana Volunteers that were getting formed. The governor decided to appoint him commander of the Indiana Legion, and so he went from being a major to being a major general almost overnight. Now, about that same time, he also was part owner of the Gatling Gun Company, and so a lot of people don't realize that the Gatling Gun Company was the American production facility was in Indianapolis and was based out of Indianapolis, and so he was part owner of that company, and he was actually one of their representatives and traveled around to the Army and to other people selling Gatling guns. So, you know, this is an early version of some of the things we have now, where you get these folks that are retired military that are serving in arms manufacturing roles. This is kind of an early version of that. He would later go on to be a trustee of Indiana University from 1875 to 1878. So again, here's sort of an IU connection. But Major General Love was in charge of the Legion for most of the Civil War period. So what did the Legion do in the Civil War? Well, a number of things. So there were three major raids into Indiana that they responded to. So the first was the raid on Newburgh, which was led by, often known for Stovepipe Johnson, who was the Confederate commander. And this is actually the raid where he earned that nickname of Stovepipe Johnson. And that was in July of 1862. And the Indiana Legion actually chased Stovepipe back into Kentucky and went across the river and chased him into Kentucky and attempted to capture him, which was actually something the Legion did multiple times. They left the state pursuing people who had made raids into the state. So then you get Hines Raid, which made it to Paoli in June of 1863. At that point, Indiana Legion captured 50 Confederates during that raid. And then, of course, the most famous Morgan's Raid, which it was in July of 1863. Hines Raid was an early attempt at Morgan's Raid. They'd kind of follow the same path, a lot of the same tactics. Morgan's Raid in July, the Indiana Legion fought at Corydon, but as infantry troops, they couldn't really hold the Confederate cavalry. So Morgan's Raid was a cavalry raid. Morgan had learned from Hines' Raid, and he was a cavalry commander anyway. He knew that the cavalry would be able to outrun the Indiana Legion because they didn't have horses. So although they're able to briefly engage them at Corydon, Morgan takes off on his horses and is able to outrun the Legion. As he moved across the state of Indiana, more Legion units would attempt to cut him off and head him off, and they would actually chase him into Ohio on his raid as he was working his way across the state. So one of the interesting things that happened throughout the war was that these companies would get formed. So let's say that Martinsville forms a company, and they're ready to go. They're part of the Legion, and then somebody comes along and says, "Hey, now we are recruiting for an Indiana Volunteers company that's going to go serve in the federal effort." And people might leave out of the Legion to go serve with the Indiana Volunteers, and so that company may join as a whole, or may dissolve itself and then go join, or it may just have so many members that join out of it that it's no longer effective. And then at the same time, you'd have veterans that are coming back from the Indiana Volunteers units serving under the federal army that would say, "Hey, I don't want to go travel around. I've done that part, but I'm willing to serve here." And so you would get new units standing up. So there's a lot of turnover in these units during this time. By war's end, at least 700 companies had been a part of the Legion at some point. So that's 700 separate units around the state of these 46 to 113 men that had been put together to serve in these companies. Now, one of my favorite things about the Legion units is their names. Because they got to choose their own names. This isn't like the military today where you were Company A, Company B, or you were even the Bloomington Company. You literally got to choose your own names. So you get some really great names like the Hoosier Guards, the Monroe Zouaves, the Boone County Bucktails, the Pike Township Rough and Readies, the Ellettsville Clappers. I'm not real sure what Clappers meant to them. That's an interesting name. The Hoosier Wildcats, the Voltigeurs. So some of these names get taken from European style units. So Zouaves, which we'll talk more about in a second, was a European style unit, and that meant they wore European style uniforms and they used European style tactics. The Voltigeurs, I'm not even sure if I'm saying that one right, I believe was a German unit in the German military, and so they were based off of what those units did. And sometimes these folks were immigrants who had experience from those units that were sort of leading this. Other times they were just things that were quite exciting to them, like the Bucktails. So the Militia Act of 1862 allowed for African Americans to serve in the militia as well, and that gets passed during the war. So before African Americans were allowed to serve in the federal army, they were allowed to serve in the militia. And Indianapolis actually provided a number of segregated companies. It's a little unclear which companies by names and records they were, but we do know that there were some segregated black companies in the Indiana Legion during this time. So in addition to those raids that we talked about earlier, what else did the Legion do during the war? Well, they had some pretty common duties that may sound a little interesting, and these were actually the things they spent most of their time doing, not defending against raids from Kentucky. So they spent a lot of time protecting draft officers. The draft was not particularly popular. Even during the Civil War, a lot of people forget that the Federal Army had to leave after the Battle of Gettysburg to go to New York City and put down a draft riot. And so the same thing happened to Indiana on a much smaller scale. So draft officers had to be protected. There were Southerners or Southern sympathizers, Copperheads, Butternuts, as they were known about, who would try and stop draft officers or attack draft officers or rile up mobs to drive draft officers out of town. And so often the Legion was tasked with providing security to the draft officers or responding to these problems. They spent a lot of time arresting Southern sympathizers and gathering and reporting intelligence about what was going on in Kentucky. And we have a 3-part series on IU in the Civil War, and if you go and watch that series on the video, you'll see there's a couple parts where we talk about some IU students who've watched the Legion come march through town and go off to go to a great barbecue over in Greene County, which the student during the Civil War referred to as Secessia. In order to arrest these Southern sympathizers. So, you get some of those sort of things that are going on. They did a lot of guard duty and guarding of prisoners. So there were Southerners that were taken prisoner. Also, just the number of law enforcement folks who were starting to arrest people for activities and then needing basically jail guards to be a part of it. We had the big prison camp up in Indianapolis. They were a part of guarding and working at the prison camp as well. They spent some time rounding up deserters, people that had left out of the federal military. But these are all very wartime sort of efforts that need to happen when you don't have a state police force, when you don't have widespread law enforcement. There's no Department of Homeland Security or any of these things during this point. So they're very much fulfilling those roles. So after the Civil War, there's not a whole lot for them to do. And so you start seeing some different takes on what's happening and why. So the 6th Regiment Act expires, but the Indiana Legion's kind of like, yeah, we're just going to keep doing this. I mean, we already bought our own uniforms and we're just going to keep going. And so a lot of Legion units kept going as local militias. So there's no longer this regimental structure, no longer this division structure, but the local level, those local militia units still existed. And so they continue to keep doing that. They become more of a local militia club. Sometimes they're funded by the city or the county. Sometimes they're funded by local organizations. Sometimes they're self-funded. So you get a lot of changes about what's coming. Now, one of the groups that really persists is the Zouaves. The folks who served in the Zouave units, Zouaves become very popular. So part of this is because of their uniforms. So this is a Civil War Zouave unit. Zouaves were based on North African units that had served in the French army. And I've even got a photo of some reenactors, because this black and white photo doesn't quite give you a feel for the colorfulness of these uniforms. These are some reenactors dressed in Zouave uniforms. These units were light infantry for the most part. They were designed to be fast and to move quickly. And so they were shock troops in a way, and they were one of the types of units that really persisted, because now they become drill units. So they march in parades and they do drills and ceremonies and stuff like that. These local militia units become a mix of truly elected leaders and self-appointed leaders, and very occasionally a state-appointed officer. So occasionally, as a political favor, the governor will say, okay, Bob down in Evansville, I'm going to say that you're a colonel and you can be in charge of all the militia units down in Evansville. Now, whether or not Bob actually did that, point is, technically he was a colonel and he was in charge of all of those units. But that was mostly rare. Most of the units were electing their own officers during this time. And units, the control over the units was really mixed. So some were self-controlled. So if you wanted to call out the local militia, you'd go to them and ask them, hey, do you guys want to come out for this? And sometimes they'd be like, no, we don't want to. Or, we're a little busy. Or, sure, yeah, we'll do that. Some were locally controlled. If they got a little bit of funding from their county or their city, then the mayor or the county might be able to call them out, or the sheriff might be able to call them out to assist them. And sometimes they did. And then a few were semi-state controlled. So there were a couple places where the state had a vested interest, be it an armory or something like that, where the state might say, hey, we're going to help fund your unit because we want to ask that you guys guard this armory for us, or whatever. So you start getting this weird sort of hodgepodge of the units. In 1895, most Indiana Legion units, but not all, are organized into the Indiana State Guard. And so you get this kind of effort to put an organization in place, and that's going to overlap with the next thing that we're going to talk about a little bit. But the Indiana Legion, really technically existed all the way through 1895 when it gets reorganized. And that's going to be the end of this section of the series. This is part 1. We're going to, next in part 2, we're going to talk about the split between the National Guard and the State Guard and how we wound up with 2. And we'll talk about that through World War II. And then in part 3, we'll talk about the birth of the modern Indiana Guard Reserve. So be sure to tune in for part 2 and part 3.